Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace and blessings be upon you, Juma Mubarak. Today, we're going to talk about marriage and feelings and relationships. And this was brought on by a rekindling of an old film, Magnolia, by Paul Thomas Anderson. It's a story about a range of people that unfold together like a flower blooming, like a magnolia. And in the middle of a flower, that would have been a more appropriate plant metaphor. We just don't have a lot of flowers growing. So I got this bush instead. But in the middle of a flower are basically plant sex organs, which contain pollen that is spread and enables the genetic transmigration from one organism to another. And that all of the enfolding fractal beauty of the flower, which of course is a very popular motif in abstract Islamic art, is a way of enticing to that genetic transmigration. And so we have this idea of a natural beauty, which is teleological in the sexual propagation of life, which is necessary to create some informational redundancy, to roll the dice, if you will, on genetic diversity, to have mutations, to have redundancy. And this is, of course, why too much cousin marriage is not advisable. And anyway, getting back to the film, the way that the film ultimately unfolds, it explores the human condition and the frailty of human feelings about relationships, not just interpersonal relationships, such as between a husband and a wife, but also between father and son and what that cycle entails. And it's in this cycle and it's in regulating it that we program the fractal enfolding pattern of civilization. And this is ultimately the functional dunya modus operandi of religion in general. And this is why there are rules about that are again anti-zina, restrictions on homosexuality, and in the Hadith, for example, or in the Torah explicitly, we also have instructions for how to raise the next generation so that there's a mimetic inheritance that continues and with minimal mutation. So it's the opposite objective of sexual reproduction. You want to limit the mimetic diversity to some extent. And then, of course, you might see this as an analogy to what's problematic about religion becoming too reformed, becoming liberalized, and then everything becomes a modernist metaphor. You don't have to affirm as many fact inferences from scripture, and your take on the rules becomes more loose and flexible. You make an appeal to context, to historical changes, without necessarily importing a robust epistemological criteria about what should change and what shouldn't. And this is where you would get criticisms against any kind of reformation. So these are things to keep in mind. But again, I digress. So when we think about this film Magnolia, we have the aging television station owner who was not a good husband to his first wife and abandoned her to die alone from cancer, and his son by proxy. And so his son, Frank T.J. Mackey, played by Tom Cruise, is this false bravado. His inner heart is wounded by this childhood experience. pickup artist seminar salesman, and he's a showman and he's got all these skills, but the way that he's manifesting them is to sell this, what you might call the prototypical red pill ideology, to frustrated men. And it comes off very sexist, and it's all based on a concept of social Darwinism. And that, and this is true, this came out in 1999, so 10 years later or 9 years later we got Neil Strauss's The Game. um, and then another 5 years later we had the proliferation of things like Tinder, and there was a pocket of naivete where guys could just ruthlessly exploit the hyper accessibility of casual encounters. And now things have gotten more convoluted. You don't know who's an AI bot, who is, if you want somebody who's cisgender, it's hard to know who's truly cisgender. um, it's just because everyone's more inured and inoculated against manipulation tactics. And also, overall, the culture has become, I would argue, perhaps more debauched. Things like performing in a pornographic context on an OnlyFans page are more normalized, or imitating perverse anime. And yet, simultaneously, people are having, and maybe this is good, but people are doing less zina. People are more isolated. They're more deracinated from a physical context of meeting people, and instead their debauchery is in synthetic forms, which is maybe part and parcel with an increasingly post-industrial transhuman situation that the younger generations growing up in. In my generation, I was just 14 or 13 when this film came out, and I was 23 when I read The Game. And I went through a lot of trouble trying to do things properly, and suffered parental alienation and domestic abuse, and also economic uh, problems that resulted from taking responsibility. And it really damaged my life. So, I came into this sort of red pill ideology for a time in my late 20s, and then ended up, when I met my wife, swinging the other way into more of a blue pill ideology, by contrast, this sort of male feminist perspective. So I've experienced a lot of angles on this, and we'll cover Magnolia and then get into the more interesting stuff. Um, so the other characters, hey, you want to say hi? Hi. Yeah, she's over there. Um, the other characters in this movie are a young boy who is suffering from this wunderkind situation as a contestant on this quiz show on the TV station, and his father is pushing him relentlessly, and it's a problematic relationship. There's an adult version of this who is building up the courage to confess his love to the male bartender where he frequents. So he's sort of washed up and facing middle age, and the fact that his life didn't amount to what it was promised to be, which is a relatable thing. And then um, there's the host of the television show who abused his daughter, who is a drug addict, because she's been damaged by this, obviously, but she's still kind of a loyal daughter. And then John C. Riley is a police officer who meets her by chance and falls in love with her, and he's a faithful Christian. And you see him on his knees praying to a crucifix and asking God for help on multiple occasions. So there's certainly spiritual thematics in this film, and the contrast and how people deal with the problem of this libido, which is the stamen in the center of the magnolia flower, and each character is a petal that's confronting this dynamic of life and this desire to embrace an eros and to be loved. But it's not just being loved in a platonic sense. There's the word hero is linked to eros, and Socrates in the symposium, when he's quite inebriated, confesses that the only thing he truly ever knew to be real was eros. And this is an admit in a sense of defeat, or it's an admission of honesty. Or maybe this is the sort of thing that the Quran is warning us about when it forestalls against intoxicants, is that we're going to become sort of nihilistic and reductivist down to our base instincts, and lamentful about that. And so, Socrates aside, you've got Julianne Moore as the younger trophy wife of the dying wealthy man who's Tom Cruise's father, and she's been unfaithful and she's feeling guilty about this. So all of these angles on how people organize their lives around this, chasing this feeling of both sexual satisfaction, but it's more than that. There's this desire to be desired on a deep level. And this is something that Islam potentially harnesses and has some answers for. And Christianity has its own template for that as well, which can be problematic. And the Muslim version has its own problems, but it is a little bit more, well, I would say significantly more understanding of the male libido and its use as a harness, its use as a carrot to motivate behavior. And so Tom Cruise is selling this red pill ideology. And there are these deleted scenes where he has this girlfriend, and she's, realistically speaking, he was married to Nicole Kidman at this time. The actress that got cut from the film is she plays the technician helper in 24 some years later, and he has to manipulate her, and he shows up late. Then he makes up a story about how his cat had to go to the hospital, and it's quite ridiculous. And it just kind of shows you the insecurity and the needlessness. It was cut because it breaks the overall flow of this otherwise this very dramatic movie. And maybe it's an unfair characterization of what probably Ross Jeffries was, the pickup artist that Frank T.G. Mackey was based on. And he taught NLP and almost these deeper Jungian pathways into the human soul through these reinforcement techniques. These are things that, for instance, if you go to the nine-sided circle, they might be teaching from a Sufi point of view as ways of reprogramming and hypnotizing yourself. So I give Ross Jeffries a little more credit than Paul Thomas Anderson maybe gave him. But nonetheless, certainly there's something very creepy about it. And and of course, Ross Jeffries doesn't, it's not as handsome as Tom Cruise, right? So there's this idea of a character who's got all these things going for him, but then he's wounded spiritually, and he has these shortcomings. And then, at the same time, uh, before Tom Cruise shot Magnolia, he was shooting Eyes Wide Shut with Stanley Kubrick as his final film, which is a remake of a sort of Freudian psychology oriented Austrian novel. And it involves this beta husband insecurity, where just the idea of your wife having a libido and a subconscious and having fantasies that she conceals, But then once you know that that it's not just this linear dynamic, that her fidelity can be topically real, but yet you haven't fully captured that eros in her. This drives a desire to sin and transgress and try to reclaim the masculinity and the power, and it becomes self-destructive. And of course, then we get into the secret society and the elites and the Mithraic tropes, and their use of Xena as a sort of anti-Salah. Instead of really connecting with somebody or connecting with God, you make it a power dynamic, and ultimately there's murder involved and all this stuff. So it becomes this whole dimensional critique of what you might call the Illuminati, or the Western social hierarchy. But at some level, also, when you think about how traditional Islam corrupted the Quran, and it took guidelines from the Quran and that reflect the Torah about marrying slaves and edifying them and giving them equal rights as wives, and it said, no, actually, this is another category. And so you had similar elites that would just have harems full of captive women and treat them like chattel, and it's just a very dark manifestation of this eros, which is in a way a primary driver of the corruption of traditional Islam. And now in modernity, where there isn't that kind of power, we have these incel Muslim men who are, oh, what if we could bring back concubinage? Then I would be happy. Allah sanctioned it. This is kufr, that I can't just abuse women and feel satisfied. And it's a very dark thing, but it's all too common. And then there's more intermediate manifestations of this dark eros in the form of the misunderstanding of polygamy as something that's just a male entitlement. It's not. They neglect the whole caring for orphans dimension, which is fundamental to it. Um, and we see this red pill meets Islam LARP, this desire to reclaim the Islamic masculine through a red pill ideology. And then when you look at um, like the Muslim marriage thread, right, we see all kinds of angles of the reality of marriage, that it's imperfect. People will be sexually mismatched. This one party will be frustrated by the other party. Um, there's obviously wandering gazes. There might be infidelity as a more extreme version of that. People lose respect for each other. So even though in the pro forma marriage, the man seems to be traditionally entitled to respect, you can't you can't compel respect. Respect has to be earned. And so I think that there's an alternative viewpoint here, which is to escape from this failure mode, which we see reflected in both the way that traditional Islam was corrupted and how that led to God's punishment, or just materially, you might just say it led to stagnancy, which led to being outcompeted by more mobile. The moribund civilization was outcompeted by the more adaptive civilization. And you might say that's God's punishment. You might say they're both true, that one follows the other. And then you have these Westoid neo Salafi incel red pill Muslim Akibros who are projecting a desire that is never legitimate in the first place, but they think it is because of the tagut that they follow. And how do we escape this failure mode? How do we make Islamic marriage more functionally adaptable and successful? So there's a clear pill, and the clear pill is, for instance, going back to Magnolia, or even Eyes Wide Shut, is Eyes Wide Shut shows more failure modality. Um, but in Magnolia, it's actually about Toba. The whole film is about Toba and people being more or less successful at the Toba. And you have Frank T.J. Mackey confronting his father and having a catharsis, and you don't get to see him change his worldview. It's left to the imagination, but it's profound enough that there's an evident catharsis, and his psychology is notably being rearranged. If the film went on to explicitly denote, okay, now he's a feminist or something like that, it would be hacky, right? Whereas what the film does do is it has the the frustrated middle-aged homosexual guy get smacked in the face by a curse of frogs, like from Exodus. So the curse of Allah literally falls upon him, and he breaks his teeth again as he falls from a ladder. So his vanity, his attempt to reassert his youth by getting braces, which was his bonding point with the young bartender, um, is set back. So this is a moderate torment for him that might lead him to a Toba, perhaps later on. This is also left to the imagination. The dying old man gets his Toba, I would say legitimately. His wife has, I would say, a legitimate Toba for her adultery. Um, the folly of using your wealth to get a wife who's younger and more beautiful, and then you have this disconnect, is laid out, but it's not belabored. There's something somewhat wise about that. Philip Seymour Hoffman's nurse character doesn't really have an arc so much. He's kind of there as a base note, just a contrast. He's the sounding board for these few for T.J. Mackey and Earl Partridge is dying and his wife. Um, then you have the daughter Claudia. Her father is obviously remorseful for having been a molester. That that was a big mistake. She ultimately gets a legitimate proposal where the cop is just like, I want you to have good self esteem, and I want to be there for you, and I want to be that guy for you. And the movie concludes with Amy Mann's soundtrack, and she's not really listening to him. She is, but it's more that there's this storm in her soul, which is the Amy Mann song, and it's feminine yearning to be loved and to be rectified from the alienation. And then she kind of says yes with her face as the last shot of the film, and it's in that turn that we have our conclusion. So there's something very clean about it. His next film, Paul Thomas Anderson's next film, Punch Drunk Love, is a little bit more explicit in the thematics, and it's just focused on one relationship. But you can legitimately be authentic and be loving and have it be reciprocated, and you're still going to have an imperfect marriage. You might get divorced. Your wife will probably experience lust for other people at some point, and then she's going to deal with that hopefully well. But it's a part of the human animal. You're going to get older. You're going to die. You know, somebody's going to die first. You're probably not going to die like right at the same moment, right? Like unless you're drowning on the Titanic together. That's another movie. It's probably people's most memorable moment from Titanic, other than obviously with the main characters. Um, and this is what the Quran is pointing us to. People get twisted about it. They think that the Quran gives men the right to divorce for any reason at any time. That's not explicitly in the Quran. They think the Quran gives men the right to sort of cheat by just initiating marriages and having some other guys witness the nikah, and a little money changes hands, and maybe an Arabic language contract is stamped by an imam. Then you can go have a coitus with this new woman. You need to get these things clear with the spouse. Allah loves those who are fair in dealing. There's this idea that you can just beat your wife if you go through these steps. No, this is that. Here's the context for when it's appropriate to get divorced. This is another one of the tests in the Quran where God is intentionally misleading people to see what they'll do, if they'll go for the obvious thing or not. And if you read the Bible and you compare them, you can come to this conclusion. The same thing with the slavery fiqh and the guidance in the Torah. So this was, of course, denigrated by the Abbasid cleriology in the early centuries, unfortunately. Um, and the Quran says that we have created spouses for you and placed between you Rahman and Rahim. as signs for those who contemplate. So if you contemplate it, and of course, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the superlative infinite limit of these dimensions of mercy and compassion, these are the most common names of Allah in the Quran. And even though the Quran is extremely threatening, and it seems like it's threatening hell, eternal hell in the sense of eternal conscious torment, rather than definitive annihilation after some perhaps long period of suffering prior to the annihilation, which was Ibn Taymiyyah's view, and that's generally my view. Illa mashallah, there are these escape valves. So this is another example where the Quran is beating you over the head with this frightening language, but then it's reminding you, but Allah is merciful, and as Jesus salam says at the end of Surah Maida, they're your servants. You can burn them if you want, but you are merciful and you are wise. So likewise, your marriage or marriages are going to be